Well, hello, everyone. I'm Jim Falk. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. And thanks so much for joining us for what I know will be a really very interesting conversation with Parag Khanna. He's the founder and managing partner of the global strategic advisory firm, FutureMap. He has worked with a number of great organizations, the World Economic Forum, the Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings Institution, the New American Foundation, and the National University of Singapore. He's the best-selling author of 6 books, including The Future is Asian, Commerce, Conflict, and Culture in the 21st Century, which came out last year, as well as Connectography, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization. He earned his BS and master's at Georgetown University and his doctorate at LSE, the London School of Economics. He's also an incredible mountain climber, but as he said, he's grounded right now. Thanks again for being with us.
So good to see you again, Jim. Thanks for having me in the program.
So let's just start because I've heard a number of your podcasts. I listened to it. I remember last year when we first talked about your most recent publication. And, to really begin the conversation, we need to understand Asia because, it's a little bit like how people look at the United States. Oh, it's New York and Los Angeles. Well, Asia is a lot more than Tokyo and Beijing.
That's exactly right. Why don't we just have a look at that map as well that's from the Connectography book. It really shows you what the kind of full geographic definition of Asia is. And by the way, this is not my definition. Geographers are not in disagreement about what Asia is. Much of what we call the Middle East is actually West Asia in geographical terms. It's not only West Asia in geographical terms, it's also diplomatically Asians, the people who we tend to think of as the real Asians, meaning Chinese and Indians and Indonesians and Japanese, think of Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Iran as West Asia because it is West Asia. It's not the Middle East. Middle East is how British refer to things, and that's where we picked it up, but it's flatly wrong from a geographical standpoint. And one of the things that I've been pointing out is that over the last 30 years, and it was 30 years ago, Jim, who can imagine how quickly time has gone by? The Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed. Since that time, all of those countries have become much more tied to China, India, Japan, Korea, and so forth than to us, right? We don't need their oil. We're diminishing our commitment there after Afghanistan and Iraq, whereas these countries are trading and investing much more so. China is the largest foreign investor and trade partner for many Arab countries. Most of the population, almost all the foreign population of the Persian Gulf countries is actually Indians, right, and Pakistanis. And Bangladeshis, right? Hundreds of, several tens of millions of them. So this is an Asian zone. So that map shows you the full Asian expanse. So one other point is that for most people, okay, fine, Asia is big. It's 4.5 billion people. But basically, it's whatever China wants, right? China is the dominant power. China gets what it wants. Well, that was, if I had to give one motivation, but there were 4 or 5 kind of bugbears for me that motivated me to do the Asia book. Number one was probably this, because Asia, unlike Western regions like Europe, North America, or the European Union, is not one civilization. It does not share a civilization. It has 6 major civilizational pillars that are quite discrete from each other, like Chinese, Indian, the Southeast Asian, even the Turkic, Persian cultures are entirely discrete, unique civilizations. They all coexist in Asia. So Asia is a different logic, different history, entirely different geopolitical background, different circumstances. And so there's never been, other than the Mongols 750 years ago-ish, there has been no single dominant power in all across the full landscape of Asia. And my contention is there never will be. And that includes China. China does not dominate all of Asia today. China will never dominate all of Asia. Now, I'll be blunt, Jim. To me, this is common sense. I'd like to think that after reading the history in brief and seeing my argument, it kind of becomes common sense to everyone else as well. But as you well know, this has got to be perhaps the biggest misconception in the entire world today, is that China rules the world and gets what it wants. The truth is, very plain to see, it doesn't and it won't.
You know, one of the things that I really got out of reading your book is, you know, we tend to think that everything has to be sort of bipolar, looking at China and the United States, but Asia over the last 2 decades, or at least the last 15 years, has really done a very good job of building up its own regional institutions. And I wonder if you might comment on that.
Sure. And that was, one of the other bugbears is sort of, Asia is whatever we want it to be. How's our alliance system faring?
Our liberal
Are the
world order.
Hmm?
Our liberal world order.
Exactly, exactly. And even not even the global part of it, but even the Asia part of it. Our post-war alliance system, our U.S.-Japan relationship, our increasing ties with India, our efforts to back Taiwan and contain China. The truth is that's all outside in. And the question you are rightly asking is, what about the inside out? And the inside out relates to economic issues, it relates to strategic and diplomatic issues as well, all weaving themselves together. So, let's start with economics. If you don't mind pulling up that slide about regionalism and regionalism displacing globalization, that helps us to understand a bit what has been happening in the last, as you said, the last couple of decades. The world has become very tripolar economically. You've got a North American zone, a European zone, and an Asian zone. And Asia, by the way, is the largest. It's 50% of global GDP, as you see these bubbles on the right. So 50% of the world GDP in PPP terms is Asian. So China the largest, then India, and so forth. Now, all of these Asian circles trade much more with each other than with the rest of the world, have much more investment across each other's borders than with the rest of the world. There's more flows of people, business travelers, tourists, students internally than with the rest of the world. They now share institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Asian Development Bank, so on and so forth. They do not have a Security Council. They do not have a European Union. They do not have a euro currency. They never will. We don't measure the extent to which Asia has, baseline of common institutions that help it regulate its relations based on European standards, or rather we should not. We tend to, but that's wrong. Asia will do what Asia will do. And it's our job to understand the extent to which they are increasingly collaborating, even if they don't have peace. They don't have to have peace. They don't have to look like the European Union. Most of the world's conflict scenarios, almost all the world's major conflict scenarios, are in Asia. So my argument is not a peace. Conflict is one of the words in the subtitle of the book, after all. I'm fully aware and examine every one of those scenarios. So you don't have to have peace to have cooperation. You don't have to, right? You can have this, this set of institutions that they have been building. And we see that again occurring in the Asian landscape. So so Asians, the most significant or the most talked about has been China's Belt and Road Initiative. And to what extent are countries collaborating, strongly, or are they subjugating themselves to China and so forth. So the Belt and Road vision, actually, as you see here, encompasses, much of the known world. What you see on this map is everything except the Western Hemisphere and Antarctica. Right. But what you have here, remember that the entire Western Hemisphere, Canada, United States, Mexico, Central America, South America, add all of that up and you've got less than 1 billion people. But Jim, as you and all of your listeners know, there's about 8 billion people in the world, right? So the vast majority of humanity lives on this map right here. Here you've got it, nice angular, nice curvature, so you can get in much of Africa, right? This is the vast, vast majority of the human population. This is all the fast-growing markets in the world because, Jim, we are not a fast-growing market. All of the markets that are still growing at all are on this map. Almost all of the growth in trade every year is on this map. And all of the new infrastructure projects that are connecting markets to each other, the supply and the demand. What is the market? It's supply and demand. All of that is happening here on this map. And as you can see, again, it's not all China dominant. It's everyone connecting to everyone. every week, when you live out here in Asia, as I do, every week you read about a new Silk Road project. Some have to do with China, some have nothing to do with China. India is working with Iran, with the Caucasus countries, with Russia to create a north-south Silk Road, right? That kind of stuff is flourishing. So everyone getting connected to everyone else is what this process is about. And in the end, we'll find that China's very, very, very important, just like the United States will always be a superpower and be very important. But China will matter where it matters, and we will matter where we matter. But everyone else also matters too. And I'm trying to create this sort of inclusive vision where the rest of Asia, the other 3.5 billion Asians, they've got a lot of ambitions for themselves. And none of those involve, by the way, being like China. And this is, again, one of these critical things that was a motivating factor for me. The more you live near China, the less you want to be like China. And this is one of these phenomena that people don't appreciate. Right now with this pandemic, Jim, as you know, we've got a lot of conversation with people saying, is China's mask diplomacy, the surgical mask diplomacy and health diplomacy with ventilators, are they reclaiming the narrative? Are they claiming that they beat the virus and we've been so awful in our response to the virus, therefore they are going to be number one? I think that's got to be the best joke of the year in this tragic, situation that we're in. Now, because imagine for a minute that you are one of the, again, 4 billion people outside of China that's in the broader Asian region. You wake up every day knowing. So again, we're talking about the majority of the human population, Jim, lives in this sort of rough time zone. It's morning, like where I am, or early morning. They wake up every day knowing where this virus came from. No Chinese diplomat on Twitter is going to convince them that this is not a Chinese virus, right? So when we have these conversations in Washington or New York or in the Twitter sphere, that China is winning the narrative, I say to myself, just relax. Spend 2 minutes in Asia and you'll realize that no one trusts China. They never did trust China because they have 4,000 years of history with China and we don't. So it's really important that we bear all of this in mind, that the world we're moving into, again, is one where everyone is trying to limit Chinese influence. Containing China or managing China is not our idea, right? It's a Japanese idea. It's an Indian idea. We woke up to it after they did. We are helping them. We're helping them substantially, and we're helping them in very important ways to respond to China and to limit Chinese influence. I applaud parts of our Asia policy over the last 20 years in our efforts to develop deeper ties with India, to sustain our ties with Japan, to help to bring about this Quad alliance. You can see at the bottom of the screen there, maybe the Indo-Pacific Quad. The term Indo-Pacific is a Japanese coinage, and India has picked it up. And it's about the unity of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean realms that come together at the Strait of Malacca, right, which separates the Indian Pacific Ocean, which, fun fact, is 500 yards to my south. It's my beach, is that confluence, the Strait of Malacca. And so the Japanese and the Indians have realized they need to collaborate more. And I think rightly from the U.S. standpoint, you said we need to help strengthen this Indo-Pacific. So now we've got the Indo-Pacific Command. We've got the Quad relationship that helps to bring together Japan, Australia, and India with us into a Quad framework, and all of which is helping also to try to limit China's expansionism. These are great initiatives and extremely important. So we are part of that story. But one of the things I point out, in the book is America is not an Asian power. We always talk about Asia's future and Asia's geopolitics as being driven by America, but sometimes we forget we are a Pacific power. We're not an Asian power. We are not a terrestrial.
So let me ask you about this. One of the very first things that President Trump did after his inauguration was to pull out of the withdrawal from the TPP. So, how damaging was that to overall geostrategic position of the United States?
Right. So extremely, because even though most of the world's conflict scenarios are in Asia, they think first and foremost about economics, right? Not so much, territorial geopolitics. They do obsess about those things. That's why you still have these conflict scenarios. So again, I'm not mitigating that. However, the reason you have not had World War III over the South China Sea, the Senkaku Islands, the Spratly or Paracel Islands, Taiwan, North Korea, is because every time they come close to bang bang, they say, hold on, that is going to unleash this chain reaction, and that's going to derail our economic growth. And we actually still need each other pretty substantially. So let's, hold off for, a while, a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. It's been 3 decades. The first article is saying that now that the Cold War is over, this is going to unleash nationalism, national rivalry in Asia. World War III is going to break out over Taiwan, and China is the next peer competitor. That was like 1992, right? So we're coming upon 30 years where we've been saying World War III is going to happen in Asia. China is going to be at the center of it. We're going to have a war with China, and Asia is going to be destabilized, and we're going to have a new hegemonic order. That was 30 years ago. It hasn't happened yet. Now, it's great to be paranoid, right? No doubt about it, right? The paranoid win. However, it doesn't mean the paranoid are right. 2 different things, right? Those wars have them because Asians also have some control over their destiny. In fact, quite a lot, and they've stepped back from this brink geopolitically. It doesn't mean that they will in all circumstances.
So U.S.-China relations were, facing some challenges over the last several years, especially when you're talking about trade, and a lot of people are giving good reviews to President Trump for some of the policies that he's pursued in China. And I'm wondering about that word decoupling of the relationship. And last night I picked up my latest issue of Foreign Affairs, and Min Shin Pei, who's a very well-known scholar on China, he wrote this: "The events of the past few months have shown that CCP rule is far more brittle than many believed. This bolsters the case for a U.S. strategy of sustained pressure to induce political change." I thought we were out of that business.
Well, I'm not going to really respond directly to his argument. I mean, it's not new, for him to be saying that. I think we know very well how successful our sustained efforts at political change have fared in a wide number of countries. I think that maybe I will respond. I don't think that anyone in Asia underestimates the brutality of the CCP. Again, you could have been living in La La Land, to put it bluntly, in the last 30 years, or say 70 years, quite frankly. But most people in this sphere of the world were not living in La La Land. So I don't think anyone that I know, again, of the 5 billion people, the majority of the human population that lives in Asia, they're not under any illusion about what kind of country or what kind of government they're dealing with, right? Even, let's remember, the Chinese people. There's a reason why the Chinese diaspora is the largest diaspora in the world, 50 million people. It's because a lot of them, generation after generation, have fled China. They fled in the 19th century. They, populating Southeast Asia in particular, they fled after the Chinese Civil War, and on and on and on. So, these things are not that difficult, quite frankly, to understand. Now let me be very clear on the second point that he's making. The Chinese regime is not going to change. And the more you try to change it, the less it will change. So this is extremely important, because this is also just basic behavioral, parental psychology almost, right? You tell your kids to do something, they're not going to do it. All right. And China is not our children anyway, right? Far from it. So China is going to be what China is going to be. It's going to have a hierarchical, centralized form of government. It always has. And therefore, it may not look like today's Communist Party, but today's Communist Party doesn't look like yesterday's Communist Party or the one from 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. It's a highly adaptive regime. In the same publication you're citing, Foreign Affairs, there has been many good articles about what is called adaptive authoritarianism. We can't just look at a map of the world and say, they're authoritarian, they're like China. They're democratic, they're like us. In fact, there's a wide spectrum of regimes. In Asia, by the way, you have more people living in democracies than in non-democracies. More people live in democracies in Asia than in the rest of the planet Earth. It's a point I make very clearly in the book.
You talk about Asian values when you're talking about government structures and democracy. Would you elaborate on that?
Sure. I talk about what I call the new Asian values, and this is, towards the end of the book. It was really one of the toughest sections to write. I mean, we're talking about this dizzying, diverse region that includes, by the way, Israel. It includes Russia. It includes India, China, Japan, Korea. Remember that Israel is geographically an Asian country. So is Turkey, as I said. So is Saudi Arabia. Australia, New Zealand belong to the greater Asian zone. Asia is a geographic word, not a cultural word. You can make it a cultural word. I grew up as an Asian American, after all, right? But the fact is, it's a geographic word. So, for example, when I go down to Australia, I always remind them, I say, you guys are white Asians, right? In fact, Australia is increasingly Asian populated in terms of ethnically Asian. So what could they possibly have in common, right, Jim? I mean, what could all these diverse civilizations and cultures and ethnicities and political systems, what could they possibly have in common? And that's what I meant with the new Asian values. And I said to myself, if you had to say that these 5 billion people have, like we talk about Judeo-Christian values, our Western, heritage and Western values, and obviously democracy, liberalism, freedom, so forth, right? What do Asians have in common? And even though they don't have democracy in common, far from it, right? You have the gold standard democracies of Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, and you've got authoritarian China and Turkmenistan and North Korea. What could they possibly have in common? And yet they do. And what they have in common is what I call technocratic governance, right? So that's of the 3 new Asian values, that's number 1. It's this idea that whether you're democracy or non-democracy, you want a strong executive branch with a vision, a 10-year, 15-year plan for how they're going to improve and transform society. Ideally, it's an accountable executive so that you have elections, you have shifts of power and authority, you have, again, a sort of measurement of progress, and the people can see transparently what is going on and have a voice in that. And even in China, that's actually the case. It's just not democratically done, but there is a voice, right? For example, they're listening to everything you're saying, right? And they actually are listening, and they actually do a lot of the things that people want. They just don't do it in a democratic way, right? So people defer to, let's say, there's a deference to a strong executive branch with a vision, and there is a strong desire for those governments of a strong civil service, an independent bureaucracy that is serving the people and getting things done, no matter who the leader is. That's extremely important. We don't need this slide right now. And in that technocratic part, let's remember, this is very important, because what are the countries that have done the best in responding to the virus, right? It is South Korea, it is Taiwan, Singapore, where I live. These are, again, either full democracies or partial democracies, but what they have in common is very, very strong civil services. What have we done, Jim, since the 1980s, in the United States? We've really let the civil service erode, right? The people, the faceless bureaucrats who selflessly go about and implement the state, right? And that's missing. In Asia, that is not missing. In Asia, that is improving. I have an infographic in the book. It's not here in this deck, but it compares, it's the World Bank's rankings, not mine, right? This is as independent verification as you could want. The effectiveness of government rankings for Asia, every country has improved, whether it's a democracy or non-democracy. Just one last thing, the other part of the Asian values thing, one of the other parts of it is the mixed capitalism. Again, extremely important. The state has a role in the economy. It picks champions, it subsidizes sectors, it invests in leading industries, it has a regulatory hand. There's welfare states to some degree. That is not something that Asians are averse to. In fact, they embrace a strong guiding hand of the state in the economy. As you know, Jim, we have not tended to like that until the financial crisis, and then it became an emergency, and now we're in a much bigger emergency now. So we are all mixed capitalists now. I think everyone needs to be clear about that. It's now just a question of to what degree. Are you a mixed capitalist system? Is it just that your central bank has flooded the market with liquidity to prop it up, which is not something you would do necessarily in a totally free market? Or is it a much stronger role with industrial policy, the way you have in Europe, where the government is actively promoting certain sectors, exports, much more than we do, or bailouts and this sort of thing? But basically Asians embrace mixed capitalism. Europeans did it first, and now we are doing it too. So a lot of these new Asian values are not just Asian, is my point. We're all waking up to some of the things that Asians are doing. So let's remember, Asians learned a lot of these things from European colonialism. Now they do some of those things better than any of us do. And now we are learning to do those things as well as we see Asians refine them. For example, the mobile phone apps. As you well, I don't think this is much in dispute. You know, WeChat in China, Gojek in Indonesia, Asians, and I can attest to this, I live here, have the best apps in the world, right? No one writes paper checks. No one, you know, goes out and cashes a check at the bank.
Right, we've seen
right?
pictures of that as people are doing the shelter in place, how they're able to pay, and we're still taking
Exactly.
our card out and putting it. And let's go over to India. Grace and Greer, what role or roles do you see India playing in shaping Asia's future? And then Kirsten, she asked about this turn that you're seeing now in India, especially with the Modi government, much more populist, much more violence, especially directed towards the Muslim population. And we certainly saw some impact and protest over the shutdown that happened so precipitously in India. So take a minute or two, a few minutes, and talk about how you see India.
Well, you know, it is extraordinary to see India attempt this genuine lockdown. You know, we always have said that every Indian election is the greatest organized human activity, you know, that's ever been performed, given the number of participants in an Indian election. Now we can actually say that this worldwide simultaneous lockdown is the greatest coordinated exercise humanity has ever conducted. But that's not to take away from India's Herculean efforts and the sacrifices that are necessary for a country that large with those disparities, you know, and asymmetries of information and you know, access to basic resources to do this. It's extraordinarily painful. But you know, and it has a lot to do with just how devastating this moment is for the world, and and the awareness of that. Also, obviously, the strong hand of the Modi government. Again, the state has been strengthening in India over the last couple of decades, right? It's not just a Modi phenomenon. The strength of the prime minister's office in the command and control, and to some degree, there's no doubt, you know, sort of you know, illiberal fashion, you know, that we attribute to Modi. That has also been happening, but I wouldn't say that that's the only definition, you know, of his government. He has invested in infrastructure so massively on a scale that no previous leader has. And it is one of the great failings of every government before his to not have picked up the slack on that. You know, infrastructure is one of the sustainable development goals of the United Nations. You can't have good education, healthcare delivery, or any of the other basic human rights that we want people all over the world, including the poorest of India, to have without the kind of infrastructure investments that he's been making. You know, a huge share, the share of India's budget that's devoted to infrastructure, whether it's railways or internet or all in between, hospitals and so on, is by far the highest percentage of a budget of any country in the world. And India needs to have that. So you have to give him some credit for some things, but his political and cultural divisiveness is not, you know, a good thing. But that said, is the country going to, you know, pull through this virus? Well, look, I'm not a doctor, but as you know from the media, it is remarkable the relatively low infection rate given the size of the population, you know, and the density of the population more than anything that they've been pulling through. So let's see. We just don't know. There could be a new wave next week, next month, you know, next year. So we have to hope. But let's remember, by the way, that India makes a large share of the global genetic, you know, drug market. So that is.
Yeah, as does China. I mean, I have to say that I was amazed, and viewers have heard me say this before, that something like over 90% of our antibiotics came from China. You know, you mentioned Singapore and how successful they have been, and yet they've had a sharp increase in the last few days of people who have fallen ill with the virus. Why is that?
Right. So this was the first country to report, you know, here in South Korea, the very first countries, look at the extraordinary number of Chinese people who come, you know, in and out of Singapore and South Korea, you know, every single day. God knows how many flights every single day. Let's remember this is a 70% plus ethnic Chinese country. Now, when it comes to the infections, amongst the general public, let's remember this is a highly stratified society, not just economically, but also in terms of foreign versus domestic. And even amongst the foreign, there is a class of migrant worker that are not actually full residents, not full citizens. Obviously, they are here on construction projects, basically. And they live in dormitories that are isolated. This is the same phenomenon you have in Hong Kong, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and here. Basically, rich Asian statelets that import the vast majority of their working population in the construction industry because they have to, because their own populations are tiny. So that's Singapore. So naturally, the workers, whether they're from Bangladesh, India, the Philippines, Pakistan, they're here for 6 months, they're here for a year, they work on a project, they go home. But they live in these dormitories, 20 people sometimes in bunk beds in a dorm. So the virus has spread very rapidly amongst that population. It is, again, for better or worse, entirely isolated from the population at large. So in Singapore in general, the 5.5 or 4-ish million people in the general residential population, the infection rate is, we get alerts, 5 times a day on our mobile phones. It's less than 10 infections a day, right? And they have this contact tracing app that is basically figuring it all out. So we actually expect that within 1 week it'll be 0. But amongst the worker population, internally to them, it's going to spread it's going to continue.
Can you get tests easily? Are you able to get tests? Could you get a test today if you wanted one?
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember the exact figure, but they're testing tens of thousands every day. And again, this is a very small country, but we've been, sort of self-isolating. Everyone has, for a couple of weeks now. But let's remember that self-isolation here, as I said, we live very close to the beach. This is a tropical country. If you're going to be isolated anywhere, I can't really complain.
Don't rub it in. Okay, we got a good question from Sam Driggers. Sam asks, taking your geographic definition of Asia one step further, could one also begin to include the west coast of North and South America? What might be the implications, political, commercial, cultural? And would you envision a long-term shift in those in those societies?
Well, it's a beautiful question. I mean, it's a large part of the book is the Asianization of the rest of the world, right? So I've got chapters on North America and how rapidly we have Asianized in North America, the largest number of new citizens every year. I think for the Texans, this will be interesting to hear. The largest number of new citizens every year has been Asians, not Latinos, right? So people taking the oath and becoming citizens the way I did when I was 15, that's actually Asians. And of course, that percentage of the population is Asian, the prominence of Asians in different sectors. Obviously, Asian Americans running for president, there's no ceiling anymore. So the Asianization of North America, Asianization of Latin America is less demographic than economic, right? Every South American country, pop quiz, fun fact, every South American country has China as its largest trading partner. Now, the geographer in me is just screaming out to remind everyone, the Pacific Ocean is the largest natural barrier on Earth to human contact, right? And despite that enormous distance, every South American country trades more with China than with America. So Monroe Doctrine, is a dated concept, right? The fastest growing trade partner now behind China for all these countries is India, which is even further away, let's remember. So we have, globalization is alive and well in some ways. Now, those numbers are going to be very volatile, right? Obviously, given the lockdown, given the economic slowdown, and the commodities bust that's happening. That said, though, there are these complementarities that regions, countries, continents have with each other, and the more seamlessly they can trade, the more those barriers come in. But have I witnessed, in a way, the Asian population and its prominence, even in Europe, right? I mean, and for me, this has been fascinating. I first started going to Germany when I was a teenager. I went to high school in Germany as well. And so for 30 years, I've been actually living in and out of Germany. and witnessing the Asianization of the even sort of, mainstream, if you will, European population, the presence of Iranians, Turks. The Turks were there first, obviously, since the post-war decades, but now Arabs and Iranians and Indians and Chinese and Vietnamese, they're everywhere. Let me give you an anecdote, by the way, because it's not in the book. But when we're in the car on holiday around Asia, we're always arguing over Spotify. What playlist are we going to listen to? And we each get a turn. Me, my wife, each of our kids. And so when it came to my turn, I was like, I actually listen to a lot of German rap. German rap music is really like lame hip hop, basically, like sung by a bunch of basically like white punk kids who were German in the 1990s. Fast forward today and look at like the Spotify German music charts, and you're going to see Eritrean and Iranian and Vietnamese rappers who were born or immigrated to Germany and have grown up there and are rapping in German, and they have created this whole new complexion for pop culture in Europe, just like North Africans have in France, for example. So even in Europe, which we tend to think of as not being as diverse as us in America, you have this Asianization phenomenon demographically. So it's really, really interesting.
What do you think the impact will be on foreign students? We often forget just the impact that foreign students have on our economy. And there seems to be a little bit of backlash perhaps coming about. And then I saw that China, in response to some of Australia's comments, have said that they might not allow Chinese students to go to Australia.
Well, so, I mean, it's not that Australia, so, right, so the way you're rightly phrasing is, there's a travel restriction on Chinese going outbound, but they themselves, even if there were no restriction, might be saying, hey, wait a minute, do I really want to go back to the United States right now for a study this fall and get sick when in China I'm safe, right? So this is, again, one of these perverse ironies and paradoxes of the situation, is that Chinese certainly feel a lot safer. They have another holiday coming up in the month of May, and there was a survey I read of Chinese travelers, and of those who responded, 75 or 80% said, we're not leaving China for this holiday. So that means that all of those countries in Asia and beyond that they would normally go to, are going to be starved of those Chinese tourist dollars. Students, anywhere from, and I'm not going to get the number exactly right, but depending on whether it's the US, the UK, Canada, or Australia, it's $8 to $10 billion of tuition money, rental money, spending
10 billion
on food and beverage in each of these countries per academic term. So massive loss. And I actually have been talking to Australian executives, including university deans and others, and Australia is going to be crushed by this. The UK as well, right? Because they obviously have they have a high dependence. Now, obviously, the United States is much, much larger. The share of foreign students as a share of our total student population is not nearly as large as it is for Australia or for the United Kingdom, obviously. So they're much more dependent on it. But remember, at a local level, it is very important in our universities as well. So I think it's going to be really problematic. There's a big competition already to do this distance remote learning. Can you attract, fee-paying Asians at a different price point doing remote education? Or what can you do to lure them back? Obviously, there's going to be a competition for talent, if you will, moving forward.
Let's take a question from Neil Gonikula. She is the executive director of the Indian American Chamber of Commerce, U.S. India Chamber of Commerce here. So, of course, her question is pertaining to India. Looking at this from an American foreign policy perspective, do you believe that India is America's greatest potential ally in Asia?
Let's remember a couple of things. First of all, Japan is the true, American ally in Asia, right? There's honestly, only one country in the world that genuinely views America as a more or less permanent ally, and that's Japan. And even the nationalist forces in Japan that want Japan to have an independent nuclear weapons capability and want us to close our bases in Okinawa and pull back our troops, they still view America as an ally. They still don't think that they could fight China and win alone, right? It's kind of logical to some degree. So the US-Japan alliance is something truly special. the word alliance is almost lost meaning in much of the world. Sometimes we even wonder if we have a transatlantic alliance anymore, right? NATO can't agree on anything for that matter, right? Ever since the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, we've seen a drift in transatlantic relations. Europeans and Americans don't agree on how to handle China, how to handle the rest of Asia, how to handle the Middle East, how to handle climate change, how to handle much of anything. And that's just our transatlantic alliance. So India, and I'm going to answer the question from the Indian point of view rather than the American point of view. I was at Brookings, for years, and there we used to, always talk about, is the U.S.-India alliance the new, twin towers of democracy, and we used all these terms. And we may want India to be a loyal American ally in the sense of joining the formation of an alliance system that used to be strong during the Cold War. But let's answer this question entirely from the Indian point of view, which is the way we should answer it. And the answer is India does not want to have an alliance with anyone, right? I wrote my first book about this idea of multi-alignment. Smart countries don't choose to be subservient to one power. Smart countries want to have good relations with America, with Europe, with China, with Russia, with all the other powers in the system, and gain maximum advantage from all of them. So India wants to, have more, the latest weaponry from the United States. It wants to be able to send more people on H-1B visas to the United States. It wants to export more software and products to the United States. Of course, India wants to have great, thriving relations. It wants to draw in a lot more foreign investment from the United States. It obviously just doesn't want American investors to actually buy Indian companies. That's a separate side issue. But India does not like to use the word alliance, right? You remember that India led the non-aligned movement, during the
Cold War. Yeah.
So India is a shrewd practitioner of my multi-alignment sort of concept. Right after a meeting with Trump, Modi goes and meets with Xi Jinping, right? He's also trying to get more Chinese investment, except for the new law that they just passed, 2 weeks ago, which is that no beneficial Chinese owner can have, any hold strategic assets in India, which is probably sensible. But they do want to export more to China. They want to trade more with Japan. They want to have this. They want to be part of this Quad framework with Japan and with Australia. So India wants to be multi-directional. America is in an extremely important, overweightedly important part of that story, but you will not hear Asians use the word alliance much, other than the Japan India. This is a concept, I explain this in detail, in the book. We think about alliances in the context of the strong bonds, usually within European history and with transatlantic relations that were, critical in World War I and World War II. Asians don't think that way. In Asian history, you will not find across 4,000 years, strong, lasting alliances. That's not the way Asians think, and that includes India.
So let me ask you this about China. We often hear US policymakers say that the United States is in a stronger position because the US has allies and China does not. Is that an accurate statement?
To the extent, again, that our notion of alliances matters, how reliable is even our alliance with South Korea? Right now you've got analysts in the United States saying that the Moon government's resounding re-election in South Korea signals that South Korea is basically going to be pro-China, and accommodating to China. They're very, very, skittish about fielding the American theater missile defense system. They're up in arms about our trade policy, obviously, tariffs on Korean, steel and other products. Japanese are too, by the way. They don't like this financial burden sharing that we're trying to impose on them. Even Australia says, hey, when we do these joint military exercises and naval exercises, can we include China? I don't, as you may know, the Pentagon does not take kindly to that request, and that's from Australia, right? So yes, we have alliances, but when the rubber meets the road, these things become highly situational. How much does it really matter when push comes to shove, right? And so, I think, again, China does not have any allies. As I've emphasized from beginning to end, China barely has any friends, let alone alliances, right? It has these relationships of convenience that may last for a long time or not at all. So Pakistan obviously comes to mind. If China has one ally in the world, it would be Pakistan. But even there, you have a lot of concerns about getting too indebted to China, too dependent on China, and so forth. And that has not been the case in Pakistan for 60 years, but it is today, where they're being cautious. So again, every country learns, or ideally, I should say, every country learns from their own history or their neighbor's history or their region's history, and realizes that they don't want to become a new colony. One of the very, very important, I think, intellectual historical points that I try to raise is that most of Asia is post-colonial countries. So post-colonial countries have lived through colonialism, they've lived through the Cold War, and now the rise of China. Now, my parents, for example, can remember the partition of India and Pakistan, right? And so they can remember colonialism, therefore. So remember that you're talking about a region where in their psychology is ingrained, we've been subjects of the British Empire, we have been second fiddle, marginalized, exploited in the Cold War, and now we have the rise of China. They don't want to be fooled 3 times, right? They do not want to enter another generation, another era of neo-colonialism at Chinese hands. And that even includes the countries that are most close to China itself, like Pakistan. So we will not repeat history, to put it simply.
You, my friend, you are a cornucopia of knowledge, and I have lots of questions, and we only have a few more minutes. So let me just do it one word: North Korea.
Oh, I don't have a crystal ball. I've been to North Korea though. I had a week long.
Any speculation that you can tell us of what you're reading in the press there about Kim Jong-un? And I'm also curious what you know about his sister.
Well, I haven't dined with his sister or with him.
You disappoint me.
So they haven't been on their guest list. I'm sure that she's a tough cookie, just like him. But let's assume for a minute, because the latest reports that I've seen say that he's actually alive. But again, I don't know. But like to see the evidence, obviously. And even when we see it could be a body double. You never know what's going on over there. But look, is it a country? I would like to think about this in a broader standpoint, and I've written about this a fair number of times. You do see a gradual evolution or a thaw, not in the brutality of the regime, but in its interaction with the world. They used to have no mobile phones. Now they have mobile phones. They have no supply chains. Now they're connected. There's markets and goods. You've got Koreans, South Koreans, Chinese, Russians, and Japanese that actually all want to invest in the commodities and mineral and mining and minerals and agriculture, and even get cheap manufacturing done in North Korea. This step by step, you've obviously got the dialogue with South Korea going. The South Korean government, one of its absolute major platforms is formally ending the Korean War, reconciling with North Korea, but pursuing some kind of reunification, even before denuclearization, which is our top priority, right? So, this is a different time and a different type of relationship that the rest of Asia is having with North Korea versus 10 years ago versus 20 years ago. And it's going, generally speaking, in the right direction. Are they still firing missiles flagrantly in all directions for no particular reason? Yes. Right? Is it still a ruthlessly brutal dictatorship? Yes. Is it a total black box? Yes. Is it a country with famine and starvation? Yes. But is it also one where each new regime, or micro era is bringing kind of, new ways of attempting to engage with its neighbors and beyond? That's also happening.
So Bob Hagan asks a good question. How and where is China active in making the RMB, the global reserve currency, over time? Could it replace the dollar? Thank you, Bob, for that question.
Right. Great question. Again, one that's evergreen, pre or post pandemic. Short answer is no. I mean, this is one of these areas where it's more evolutionary. It's not like, okay, well, it was the pound and then it was the dollar and therefore it must be the RMB, right? That's, again, history doesn't really work in these cycles of you must have one hegemon and you must have one currency dominated by that hegemon, right? It may have worked that way in two very particular phases, and if you want to cherry pick from history, you can say that. But again, yes, China is the largest trading partner of most countries, but a lot of countries again are trying to diversify their trade. Their trade with China is actually decreasing. China is actually importing less in some degree. So then the question is not so much do you need to hold RMBs to trade with China, especially if we're moving towards a world of greater regional self-sufficiency. The other is, again, you would want to control your monetary policy, which you would lose control of, in an RMB world, and you don't necessarily want, obviously your currency, interest rates and so forth set by another power that you have no influence over. So that's another reason. Third is the dollar is still by far the largest reserve currency, and yes, you will have countries are already selling their dollar reserves because they need the money right now, especially the oil-dependent economies. So you may have a slight.
Go ahead. I've got another question, but
right,
finish
so
your
thought.
You
might have a slight decrease in a U.S. dollar holdings, but you also have again these totally sort of lateral phenomena coming in, like cryptocurrencies, the growing role of the IMF, strategic SDR denominated reserves, and this sort of basically the world moving more towards a multi-currency reserve system, or maybe even potentially some kind of an international crypto instrument that is, weighted to a basket of currencies, rather than everyone saying, oh, well, let's just, China's got the world's largest economy, therefore we all hold RMB in reserve. That's just literally never going to happen.
So let me do this with you, if you'll allow. Rapid fire. We got about 4 minutes left, so let me just hit some of these areas that we've not touched on. Hong Kong. We had seen protests. Now they're not there the way they were, largely because of the virus. What do you expect to happen?
And also because they've been arrested.
That's a good point.
And that was happening before the virus, and it's accelerated afterwards. So again, this is rapid fire, but since the handover in 1997, we've seen a very rapid erosion in the kind of degree of democratic freedom in the country. It's part of a much longer process that began 23 years ago. Sadly, we don't see an exit from that. So that it's going to be, more and more China dominated.
Paul Pass asks, what do you think is the future of ASEAN? What can they learn from the successes and failures of regional integration, such as obviously the European Union?
They're learning a lot. Again, there will be no European Union, there will be no Asian Union, there will be no ASEAN Union, but they're doing a lot of the right things. A lot more supply chains coming and integrating across the region, a lot of borders coming down, a lot of freedom of mobility across Asia, across ASEAN. So in almost every way, ASEAN is learning to bootstrap, and build out complementarities. Again, I live in Singapore. I think of Singapore as like the capital of ASEAN in many ways, unofficially. But of course, everyone comes to invest here. They learn lessons from the government here and so on. So they're going in the right, it's a lot of micro things that people don't pay attention to day to day, but how to improve stock exchange regulation and integrate, how to fix your investment laws and how to build your civil service and have better water sanitation. All of these things are things that Asians are learning from other Asians right now within ASEAN, and it's leading to improved quality of life in countries like Myanmar, Indonesia, Cambodia, Vietnam, and so forth. So some of these countries are very pro-China in terms of their regimes, but socially, of course, they're very much part of the polyglot melting pot of ASEAN. I'm very, very bullish on this region, not just because I live here. It's really one of the only regions of the world that's growing economically and that's undertaking these reforms.
So if you were invited to be in Joe Biden's basement, what would you advise that he consider if he were elected president?
Wow, that one's going to take a whole other session, Jim. Look, so again, as I said, some of the things we're doing in Asia policy are spot on, like the Quad relationship. We're helping to build the capacity of Vietnam, of Indonesia, of the Philippines to defend themselves, to stand up for themselves, to help counter Chinese pressure in the South China Sea. We could be pushing more for a diplomatic settlement to some of these disputes rather than have them be lingering threats in the background that are a risk to us because of our commitment in the region. We don't want to be the tripwire caught in the crossfire. In this region, it's not worth it. Asians should step up and settle their own conflicts. So I'd like to see, kind of some bold diplomatic initiatives in that area. I would like to see us do TPP. You asked that question earlier. It's been very damaging because, again, economics matters, right? So investing in the region, making where you sell, offering that high quality of products and goods and services, so trading more, investing more with the region is obviously critical as well.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us. We had lots of questions left over, but I think we managed to hit a number of them. And as always, I appreciate so much seeing you. Wishing you all the best, especially your wife and children.
Thank you, Jim. Really appreciate it. It's so good to see you again.
And let me remind everyone that you can pick up copies of Parag's two most recent publications, Connectivity and The Future is Asian, by going to interabangbooks.com. Put in dfwworld and you'll get a 10% discount if you're able to go to the store, or they offer free shipping if you're not. Again, special thanks to all of our 2020 webinar sponsors. Really appreciate that. And all of you stay safe and look forward to seeing you Friday.
Thanks so much, Jim. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.